Okay, we are started now. Sorry about that delay. Um, so within the pupil-centered funding plan website through Department of Education, when we navigate there, you'll see that we have the ability to see on the right side helpful resources and then revenue and funding categories. I want to share that with you now so that you can see. Bit of a delay there, but this is what I'm talking about when you come here to our link over here, all the resources that I'm sharing and that we're reviewing in this three-part series together. So most of the resources that I shared, I don't know if you can track my mouse over here on the right side in the overview, that's what we did last time during part one. And today we're going to focus in these resources here, revenue and funding categories. And then we also get into how those are distributed. So with the resources I'll share today, a little bit of review based on part one, but diving a little further into those nitty-gritty details as well. Okay. So I'm going to launch a video that we have. Again, this is part two of our 5-part series in our videos. This is one of our longer videos. It's about 15 minutes. I'm going to cut out the first part of it. But I think it's a lot of great information that has to do with our revenues and those distributions, but also a little bit more detail about how the plan itself and the model works that I find very valuable. In fact, every time I watch it, I have more takeaways. And then we'll discuss a couple of things that I really kind of want to hone in on to provide additional clarity, and we'll move forward with our presentation. So,
welcome to this presentation on Nevada state and federal sources. Section 2, PCFP details and calculation. In this section, we'll walk through the basics of how the PCFP allocation for each LEA is calculated and answer some frequently asked questions about PCFP funding calculations. Education funding in Nevada and through the Nevada Plan included over 30 categorical funds with specific intended uses. The PCFP consolidates many of those categorical funds into one consolidated education funding plan. The transition to the PCFP moves Nevada's structure for education funding from a defined spending plan to a more flexible funding plan based on student needs. Categorical funding streams are now combined into the adjusted base allocation of funding per student, adjusting for size and regional differences, or into one of the 3 weighted funding streams based on student characteristics. Local special education funding is for students with individualized education plans, or IEPs, and auxiliary services funding covers operational costs such as food service and transportation. With fewer defined spending streams, districts and school leaders have more flexibility in determining how to best meet the needs of their students. The PCFP combined many categorical funding streams. However, several funding streams still exist outside of the plan, including adult education, the Education Trust Account, federal funding, Nevada Department of Education and State Board of Education funding, pre-K, professional development, special education, and the Teach Nevada Scholarship. Funding for education under the PCFP has been divided into 4 primary tiers. First, Tier 1, auxiliary funding for school operations, such as food service and transportation. Tier 2, local special education funding for students with IEPs. Tier 3, adjusted per pupil base funding for each student to ensure a guaranteed basic level of financial support for each student. And Tier 4, weighted funding for students identified as English learners, at risk, and gifted and talented. Auxiliary funding is to be used for food service, transportation, and other operational expenses deemed appropriate by the state legislature. Allocations are distributed to school districts only, excluding charter schools, and are based on a 4-year average of a school district's actual reported expenses. Charter schools may receive separate grant funds for similar purposes, such as transportation. Tier 2, Local special education funding represents the amount a school district or charter school would transfer from its general fund to maintain its federal maintenance of effort or MOE requirement. Maintenance of effort requires that school districts maintain at least the same level of funding for special education from one year to the next. Allocations are based on a district's total actual expenditures in the prior year as reported in the annual financial report. Additional considerations. School districts funded by the fiscal year 2020 baseline retain the flexibility to transfer funding from weighted categories of the PCFP to the general fund. Other school districts also retain the ability to increase the amount of funding for special education services by transferring funding from the adjusted per pupil base funding allocation, discussed later in this slideshow, if additional funding is needed for that purpose. These adjustments may impact future federal maintenance of effort amounts. Tier 3, the PCFP combines specific local and state revenues to provide guaranteed basic level of financial support for each pupil to receive a reasonably equal education opportunity, regardless of which county they live in. Every student generates an equal allocation of funding that can be used to pay for things such as teacher salaries and benefits, materials and supplies, and other expenditures necessary for running a school or district. This per pupil funding base is then adjusted based on attendance area and the Nevada Cost of Education Index. This adjusted base funding accounts for the majority of dollars for a school or district's general operating budget. The adjusted per pupil base allocation is calculated based on the following components: the statewide base, initial amount per pupil, which is the same for every school district, charter school, or university school for profoundly gifted students. The Nevada Cost of Education Index, or NCEI, is a composite multiplier factor to address regional cost differences experienced by school districts due to differences in the cost of labor and goods. The NCEI includes two elements. One, the Cost of Wage Index, or CWI, is a wage measure that calculates the cost of attracting staff due to a variety of community factors. The CWI is applied to the portion of the base funding associated with wages. 2, a cost of goods is applied to the non-wage portion of base funding. Lastly, the attendance area adjustment. This adjustment accounts for the increased cost per pupil to operate public schools in smaller settings that are often in more remote and rural areas. This multiplier is based on attendance areas set by the Nevada Department of Education and provides additional dollars to support these settings and provide a reasonably equal education opportunity to their students. A school district may serve multiple attendance areas and will receive a combined adjustment proportionately based on the relevant attendance area adjustments for each attendance area within the school district. Tier 4, weighted funding. The PCFP provides additional funding to districts on a per pupil basis through weights for students with additional needs in 3 categories: English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students. Weights are calculated as a percentage of the statewide base allocation that every student receives. Counts for English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students are based on October 1 count validation day data submitted to the Nevada Department of Education from the previous year. Weights are calculated as a percentage of the statewide base allocation that every student receives. The count of students in each of these 3 categories is unduplicated, meaning that students are counted in the highest weighted category in which they qualify, and they cannot qualify for funding for multiple weights. English learners. Using the state's existing definition, the students included in the count for the English learner weight are students who speak a language other than English at home, scored below 4.5 on an English language screener, and do not qualify for special education services. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by the 0.45 weight. At-risk students. The state identifies at-risk students who need extra help to graduate with their cohort. To do this, each student is assigned a grad score. This score is calculated by a machine learning computer program that analyzes approximately 75 data points about a student in areas including academic performance, attendance, behavior, and home and economic stability. The program uses these factors to determine how likely a student is to graduate on time. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by a 0.35 weight. Gifted and talented students. The state defines gifted and talented as a person who possesses or demonstrates outstanding ability in one or more of the following: general intelligence, academic aptitude in a specific area, creative thinking, productive thinking, leadership, the visual arts, or the performing arts. The PCFP formula provides funding for students who qualify as gifted and talented who did not qualify for additional funding through special education services or through the English learner or at-risk weights. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by the 0.12 weight. Let's review the distribution of the weighted funding. First, districts receive an adjusted base allocation for each of their students. Next, districts receive special education funding and students with disabilities are removed from the pool of eligible students for additional weighted funding. Of the remaining students, students identified as English learners are counted for weighted funding. Of those remaining students, not including those who qualified for special education or English learner weight, students identified as at risk are counted for weighted funding. Lastly, of the remaining students, not including those who qualified for special education, English learner, or at-risk weights, students identified as gifted and talented are counted for weighted funding. Students can only generate funding in one category, but districts can receive funds in some or all categories, depending on the students they serve. At risk, a new measure of student need. The PCFP focuses on students who need the most help. A machine learning computer program analyzes approximately 75 data points about each student in areas including academic performance, attendance, behavior, and home and economic stability. The program uses these factors to determine how likely a student is to graduate on time. The formula provides funding for the students identified in the lowest quintile or 20th percentile of grad scores statewide. The district is eligible for extra funding for those students. Because students who are counted as at risk for funding purposes are identified through a statewide calculation to determine the lowest quintile or 20th percentile of scores, rather than a school district by school district calculation, districts may have more or less than 20% of their students identified and funded with the at-risk weight. Additionally, some of the students with the grad scores in the lowest quintile statewide may also have a disability or be an English learner, in which case they would be supported with the local special education allocation or generate the higher English learner weight. In either case, they would not generate the at-risk weight. Hold harmless. The PCFP also includes a fiscal year 2020 baseline per pupil guarantee or a hold harmless allocation. The intent of this provision is that a school district receives a reasonably similar level of funding on a per pupil basis that it received during the fiscal year ending on June 30th, 2020. With this baseline guarantee, the intention of the legislature was to be able to transition to the PCFP without causing an unexpected loss of revenue for any school district if the district would receive less funding under the PCFP than it received in fiscal year 2020. This baseline per pupil guarantee is only applicable to districts. Now, we'll review some frequently asked questions about how PCFP funds are calculated. When are students counted for the purpose of funding? The weighted funding is updated each year based on the October 1 count data. NDE will notify school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students of the updated funding amounts near the end of the calendar year. For example, the October 1, 2021 or fiscal year 2022 count day data will be used to set the weighted funding for fiscal year 2023. NDE provided notification regarding these adjustments near the end of 2022, understanding that many districts and schools begin the budget development process in January of each year. NDE disperses funds to school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students monthly, beginning on August 1. Each monthly payment is 1/12 of the total legislatively approved amount for auxiliary services, local support for special education services, and weighted funding in the 3 categories for English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students. If a student transfers mid-year, how does that impact funding? Mid-year transfers do not impact funding for that year. Funding amounts are based on student counts from October 1 of the previous year to allow for the state to calculate allocations and for schools and districts to determine budgets in the spring before the school year begins. Because funding is allocated to charter schools and school districts and not to schools within a district or to individual students, no adjustments are made from the state level to account for student mobility between schools within a district, between districts within Nevada, or between Nevada and another state. School and district leaders have the flexibility to determine how to shift resources between schools to best meet student needs. Any changes in student needs and location will be accounted for in the next school year's budget. If a student moves after October 1, this adjustment will be accounted for in the following school year. What if a student qualifies for more than one weight? Pupils who qualify for more than one weighted category must receive the services for each of the weighted categories for which they are eligible. For example, a student classified as both at-risk and an English learner would receive both Victory and Zoom services. And while the PCFP does not include the special education multiplier as a weight, students eligible for special education services must also receive services for each of the weighted categories for which they are eligible. Because weights are not stacked, students receive funding with the highest weight in which they qualify, in this order: special education funding for students with individualized education plans, English learner students who do not qualify for special education funding, at-risk students who do not qualify for special education funding or the English learner weight, or gifted and talented students who do not qualify for special education funding, the English learner weight, or the at-risk weight. Why does the PCFP use prior year counts rather than funding current enrollment? While exact student counts change from one year to the next, using counts from the prior fiscal year allows budgets to be set and district and school leaders to make spending decisions before the beginning of an upcoming school year. Watch our next section in this series for information on how revenues for education are calculated. Welcome to this presentation on Nevada's Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. This information
Sound check, testing. Are we back? Oh, great. Thank you. I saw a thumbs up. So as I was saying, I wanted to, as I was learning about the PCFP and the model, I had additional questions beyond what the high level video shared that I thought would be helpful to share with all of you. And one of those was kind of how all of these pieces fits together within the state education fund. So the state education is kind of like the big warehouse for disbursements, for revenues received, but it's also made up of another account, and that's the education stabilization account. So here's kind of a flow chart putting those pieces together in a visual. So up at the top, we have our revenue sources. And I think the video kind of talked a little bit about the different revenue streams that were brought together to fund the PCFP. And those revenues then go into the state education fund, Fund 2609. Sometimes you'll hear that referenced as well. And then flow through the different tiers of the PCFP. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. And this is how the amounts that you receive in your monthly payments are decided upon and then dispersed into these tier categories. Then as part of this overall process, we have the education stabilization account, which is really kind of the savings account of the state education fund. So if there happens to be an excess state education fund balance, meaning revenues were higher than we were allocated in spending, at the end of the biennium, those excess revenues would flow into the state education stabilization account. Or there is provision in NRS that if district end fund balances exceed either their fiscal year 2020 end fund balance or 16.6% of their prior year allocations, those excess funds could be returned to the education stabilization account. And they would stay there kind of as a savings account. If the education stabilization account exceeds 20% of the allocation for the state education fund, those extra revenues above the 20%, and we see that in this bottom blue area here, would flow back into state education fund for to be reallocated. So that's kind of how the things fit together. And I can pause right here because I saw a hand up. Stephen, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so in that blue box under the education stabilization account, district level excess ending fund balance.
Yes.
So that is completely separate and different than the SB 282.
Senate Bill 282.
Correct.
Have that. Are you in Clark County?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is different from that one. So there's one mechanism that applies to all of the school districts, that when your end fund balance exceeds 16.6% of your budgeted amounts, then the amount that exceeds that transfers to the education stabilization account, except for the grandfather clause that was put into place in fiscal year 2020, where if your end fund balance at that time exceeded 16.6%, you were allowed to maintain that level until it reduced. And then once you drop below that 16.6, once you exceed that, then that amount is transferred back. And then for Clark County, yes, SB 282 identified at the school level as related to NRS 388G, that at the school level, if it exceeds 5% after 2 years, then that is supposed to be transferred to the state education fund. So that is something I think we are just now coming up on that first 2-year clock, and we're going to be needing to sit down with your team and work through what that looks like.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Good question. So one of the other questions that I had is, what exists still outside of. And this was presented in the video, but it was pretty quick. So I wanted to draw some extra attention with that. And so here are some things that exist outside. Some of them are outside of K-12 education, but I also wanted to draw your attention to the Special Education Fund, Fund 2619, is paid outside of, and that is the state's fiscal support for special education. And those are received as quarterly payments. And we'll get into that with the disbursement in just a little bit. But again, I wanted to draw attention to that special education. It does affect K-12 and it's provided outside of the PCFP. This is something that I wanted to share with you. It is a change this year with Tier 1. So within the Tier 1 auxiliary function, and again, this is governor's recommended budget and where they placed this. So I know that this is also on your radar at this point. Again, it has to be approved, but this is where the transportation, which has now been, if passed, will be expanded to include charter schools, where the salary adjustments for the Senate Bill 231 that was passed in 2023 for teacher raises will provide funding. And this is out of our Tier 1. So doesn't affect the statewide base. It's kind of carved off the top. But again, this would need to be passed through legislation and then be part of our allocation that we receive for the fiscal year 26 and 27 biennium. So I just wanted to just show that this would be a change to the model if it were passed. And of course, all of us have fingers crossed for that to happen. Hold harmless provisions. The video did talk about two, again, pretty quickly, and I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that. So the initial hold harmless provision for the allocation of the PCFP was put into place with the plan in fiscal year 2020. And this ensures that no district would receive less funding under the PCFP than they had in fiscal year 2020. Okay, and this was also for charters, except that they were all lumped together. And of course, and so it was in play. At this point in time, we still have 3 districts that are protected under this hold harmless allocation. The second one has to do with your enrollment, and it was added in fiscal year 2022. Oh, the enrollment has always been there.
Yes.
Did it change?
No.
Okay.
We have always had a hold harmless provision for enrollment.
Okay. Thank you, Megan.
But only for, in this case, what is the adjusted base enrollment? There is not a hold harmless provision for depleted category enrollment. Correct.
So that was a good designation. Hopefully you all heard that. So this is in the event that your average daily enrollment changes, and this is for the statewide base per pupil. So does not affect Tier 4 weighted and weighted categories, but for the statewide base, should that change by more than 5%, meaning your enrollment has declined by more than 5%, you would be paid the higher amount of your prior year's enrollment for that quarter. This is to protect your funding so that you don't have extreme fluctuation throughout the year within that statewide base. Okay, I have another video that I want to share with you that has to do with revenues that flow into education, providing a little bit more detail. Nothing like the last one. This is like a 2.5-minute video, very quick. And then again, I have a few things that I want to draw your attention to based on this additional information. So in our 5 videos here, I'm going to start. This is Revenues of Education, Part 3, and I'm going to forward past those 30 seconds or so, where it's just introducing the 5 videos in the series.
Welcome to this presentation on Nevada other state and federal sources. Section 3, Revenues for Education. In this section, we'll review how revenues for education are collected. The State Education Fund is the primary fund for public education in Nevada. To support transparency, previously available state and local revenues, including state categorical funding, are now combined into the State Education Fund and redistributed through the PCFP. Revenues to fund the State Education Fund include local support tax, the general fund, property tax, and other state and local taxes and fees, including net proceeds of minerals, both state and local, gold and silver tax, governmental services tax, recreational marijuana tax, local school support tax, annual slot tax, room and property tax, Federal Mineral Leasing Act tax, franchise fees, proceeds from forfeited properties, fines, interest distributions, and others. In addition to the State Education Fund, there is a second available account to the PCFP. The fund is in the Education Stabilization Account, come from the following sources: school districts with an ending fund balance greater than 16.6% of total budgeted expenditures, and unexpended money in the State Education Fund at the end of each fiscal year, unless otherwise excluded. The State Education Fund allocates PCFP and other education funds to school districts. Any unexpended funds in the State Education Fund due to less than projected enrollment or greater than projected revenues are allocated back to the Education Stabilization Account. Any school district fund balances above 16.6% more than the total expenditures are also sent back to the Education Stabilization Account. The Education Stabilization Account is only to be utilized under the following conditions. Revenue collected in the State Education Account is 97% or less than the authorized amount, or the balance exceeds 15% of the appropriations authorized in the State Education Fund. Watch our next section in this series for information on the allowable use of PCFP funds.
Okay, so touched on a little bit about the things that we've talked about, but also added a bit more detail about the education funds. And I want to go back to the PowerPoint now. And again, pull out a few things. So this is kind of a nice little visual of revenues within the biennium, where they come from. So local, state, and then general fund appropriations, kind of seeing the makeup from year to year within the biennium. Pretty consistent as far as the makeup of those funding sources. And then jumping into net proceeds of minerals. This was one that a revenue source that just works and set up a little bit different than the others. All of our other revenue sources are allocated into that fiscal year and are available to use the year that they're generated. So for instance, if we have hotel tax would be collected and then deposited into the State Education Fund, and then it's available for dispersed the next month into your monthly payments. However, net proceeds of minerals is unique in that it may not be spent in the year it's accrued. I won't get into the specific laws associated with that, but this is kind of a visual on how that works. So you can see in fiscal year 24, in this example, 15 million was created in revenues for net proceeds of minerals, but it cannot be spent. In fiscal year 25, that amount, that 15 million in the green box, is carried forward into fiscal year 25, and now it is available for distribution within those monthly payments. Whereas at the same time, we have additional revenues being collected and deposited into the state education fund, but they cannot be distributed in that year. They have to be carried forward into fiscal year 26. Okay, it's the only revenue stream that works this way. And just wanted that every now and then this comes up in questions, and it took me a second to get my head around it. And I wanted to be able to share that with you as well. In the actual payments, so there's a few things happening for your PCFP payments. There's an annual allocation split into 12 equal payments, as the video said. The monthly payments are made on the 1st of every month, and payments are distributed August through July. So it's a month separated from our traditional fiscal year. Okay, and that's basically so that we can get started when session closes in the biennium to draw the funds and apply the allocations. So August through July, okay? Adjustments to payments can happen through quarterly enrollments, and we heard some information about that in the video. And again, you'll see that HH is my note to myself and to you that is the hold harmless to protect your the consistency of your revenues coming in should your enrollment decline more than 5%. Okay. That would change. So if you have an adjustment enrollment, which most people do, it fluctuates per quarter, that would affect the monthly payments for the next quarter. And then you also have adjustments to payments can include charter sponsor fees on the first payment of the quarter. And then if you're a charter, you also have the, sometimes you'll have a loan payment that needs to be repaid. And that is submitted annually. And then that would come out on the first payment of every quarter. And I believe that only affects charters. For the distribution process, we also have 2 different true-ups that happen. And those would be taking place. So the first one is the true-up adjustment. This has to do with the enrollment adjustments for the prior quarter. And those adjustments are either paid or reduced from your first monthly payment of the quarter. So if you had more enrollment than was projected or included, we would be providing you additional revenue. If you had less enrollment, then there would be a true up. We would subtract that from your monthly payment, that first payment of the quarter. Okay, an annual true up also happens at the end of the fiscal year. So statements are generally issued by the end of August. If you have a balance owed, we request that by October 1st. If it's not paid, then in full, then it would be withheld from your November payment. And so that happened just this last fall. We're in communication with you ahead of that time before we would withhold payment. And in very rare cases, that payment is a substantial amount, and we wouldn't want to take all of your November payments. So sometimes we'll break that up into chunks, but we'll be working with you should something like that happen. And that is available as well. If it's a credit, those credits are also posted with that November 1st payment. Moving on, so that kind of concludes what we were going to talk about today. Again, we have part 3 of this series coming up in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today on November 12th, again at 10 o'clock. Sorry, February 12th. And we'll be talking about using people-centered funding plan funds strategically, grading those with different funding sources, and then also providing resource links to utilizing those funds. At this point, we want to open it up to any questions. You're welcome to post those in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. We'll call on you one at a time. And I appreciate everybody showing up today and going through this with us, building that community around our PCFP. So first hand that I see is Stephen. Oh, we can't hear you.
Your slides do a good job of explaining what the Legislative Committee on School Funding calls the waterfall. But one thing I didn't see there is for the students, the pupils who are not in any of those buckets. They don't have an IEP. They don't qualify for the three other buckets in the weighted. It's what I would call your basic funding. Do you have something in the future on that? How does that
So-
fit in other words?
Looking for more detail within the statewide base piece. So how we're identifying or how we're calculating the funding for that tier. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, is it just everything left over, or does or maybe I just missed it in your slide that it's a base funding for all pupils regardless of any type of specialized education.
It is. So in the base funding, I'm going to back up for just a second. Sorry if you get a little dizzy here. So it's in this tier 3 category. Okay. And that would be our statewide base for pupil funding. So this last year, $9,414 was applied to each student. That was the average. So we have to remember that I'm going to actually jump out of this for a second and pull up another piece that I think would help explain this.
Is that what we're covering in our third presentation too then?
We can definitely jump into it in the third presentation a little bit more. So in the video, it did have some information on the additional calculations within that tier 3. And so it covers, there's an attendance area adjustment that's provided for small schools and very rural schools based on distance from other locations and the cost that it is to provide the same level of education or an as equal education as possible to that student.
And is that at the precinct level or at the district level?
It can be down to the school level. So it's an attendance area adjustment.
Yeah,
But
so
that's built in before the LEA actually gets the full amount. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
yes, it's reflected in the per pupil amount that is allocated to each school district. It is a school level analysis based on where they are located. So our closest example for us would be in Washoe County, Gerlach, for example, is geographically distanced further from the Reno Sparks area. And so because it's further away and theoretically it's costing more to drive there and get resources and services, there is a calculation that accounts for that adds money to that district's per pupil to help offset those costs.
Okay, because we've got this other thing down here in Clark, which we affectionately called the proportionality. Well, it's in one of the NRSs where it talks about rural and specialty schools. If your office is already calculating that, if we could just numerically just have that amount, that would really help us to be able to disseminate what that proportionality needs to be to the schools that apply for it or who should get it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, and that information is located in the legislatively approved budgets that we do share with everyone once they're provided after the end of session. So after this session ends, we can schedule some additional time after the model's received to walk through that in more detail, so that you're familiar with where it's located and can find that information.
Oh, that would be very, very helpful. Okay, and then one other question, over to the weighted funds. So the weighted
Okay.
fund, when you look at the NRS and there's the various weights, 0.45 and 0.12, et cetera, that is the calculation at your level, at the NDE level, that ratio is applied against the state base funding amount. And that's what gives the LEA the bucket full of, let's say, EL, or the bucket to calculate the at risk. Okay. Is there, because I've had this question a few times posed to me, we have always, as a district, we've just taken that full number that we receive for EL or at risk, and that's the amount that we push out to our pupils. There's no expectation that we maintain the ratio against either our adjusted base or the state base. Is that correct?
So for the students with IEPs, the funds should follow them. For the students identified as EL, the funds should follow them. For at-risk, it's a little bit different because we're using that grad score. And when we pull the data in October to identify those that fall into that quintile, and then it necessarily isn't going to push down perfectly from the LEA to the school.
Okay, so my question is not that it follows the student, because we definitely, identify for special ed and for EL, etc. It's if we get 50 million, if the LEA receives 50 million, is there any expectation that the LEA put more than 50 million for that weighted fund? And it's because of the ratio, that the language in the NRS, it's sometimes difficult to see, oh, are they talking about the LEA, or are they talking about NDE at the top, at the state level?
So the concept and the anticipated outcome is that is money that has been allocated regardless of at-risk EL gate, has been allocated to a district to serve the needs of their students. If that is not sufficient to meet those needs, then the LEA has the authority to transfer funding from adjusted base or another eligible pot of funding to meet the additional needs that are above and beyond what the state has allocated through that pot of funding.
Okay, and we do that in GATE, for example. We augment quite a bit from what the state gives us for GATE. The question is really more a compliance question as to maintaining the NRS ratio that's declared.
So Steve, when you
and
say,
it sounds like it's more, from what you just said, it sounds like it's more needs based. So there, as long as the specialized education is met, There is no expectation to increase the ratio to whatever the state level ratio is.
Are you referring to like the 0.45
Yeah.
for, okay, so that is not like that's a, how would you say that? That's a calculation for funding, not necessarily, I think it's apples to oranges.
It's a calculation for funding, not a per pupil calculation.
Expectation
Expectation.
at
Okay.
the LEA level. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for sticking with us while we
because
got to the bottom of your question.
That's what I've been telling people, because that was my interpretation. But the words are a little squishy. So thank you very much. That I can sleep now.
And I'm gonna pull something up for you real quick that other than the videos, I want to draw your attention. There we go. There's a little lag, so I have to wait for the slides to catch up. On our website here. So again, in this part 2 series, we're working with these 4 documents, and I kind of showed the videos. But in this guide, it's rather lengthy, but Steve, you might have some, and everybody, you can go in here, and what I like is I can just jump in here. I can do a keyword search and jump right to it. So for instance, you asked a question on
rural proportion.
This piece, what part jumps into the tier 3 adjusted base calculation, and you can read a little bit more here about how that works. But it's a rather lengthy document. I want to show you that it's available, but there is a little bit more detail than what's in the video, but also the same visuals. So you can use those to kind of clue you into what you're looking for and scroll rather quickly through this. So you'll see auxiliary funding, each of the information on the tier 2, very similar to what the video said, but again, in this narrative. And if you wanted to know more about the cost of index or the attendance area adjustment, you'd be able to find additional detail here. Of course, you're welcome to reach out to us as well. Okay, but this might be a great resource for you to be able to dive into. And I think in that, those ratios are also present with that visual that we saw in the video, if that's helpful.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Does anybody else have any questions or anything that we can help you better understand, or what you were really hoping to have, and maybe we can work that into part 3?
This is Kyle from Delta Academy. I just was wondering if, is it possible to get this, like the list of students who do qualify for the weighted categories, especially the at-risk, just so we know kind of the 70 some data points, or maybe just share that. So just curious to see how that's all calculated, what they look at.
So I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a lot of talk about grad score and that calculation. So of course, we don't have the details on how it's calculated, but we do have the criteria.
Yeah, and so I think we do have some materials posted on our office website now about the definitions of those counts. We can share the list of metrics that have been provided by Infinite Campus that they use in the determination. But yes, we have materials on those counts and how they're evaluated and identified. So for like EL students, they have to place in a certain percentile within for WIDA scores, and we can share all of those with you.
Thank you so much.
Other questions?
I have another one.
Okay.
Okay, so back to the grad score. How often does Infinite Campus reflect the most updated grad score for the LEA?
So that is actually a score at the LEA and school level within the early warning system that is refreshed daily. The state, we pulled a point in time in October when we do the validation day count and identify the number of students who fall within that category statewide. And then we provide a cut score effectively to share that with you so that as you're going through this on a day-to-day basis, you can compare the students who fall within that score to your records to help identify the students who are to be served. But that score is actually updated daily as those indicators for the students change.
Okay, because the question of the grad score, getting the actual data down to the school level has vexed us greatly. If your office actually queries Infinite Campus for your purposes, and you get a cut score and you get a data at the district for each of the districts, is there a way for the district to get that same data set so that we're working literally with the same data set, not something 3 weeks later, what have you?
So keep in mind that we only pull that data once a year.
In the prior 2 years, because this is only our second year of implementation. Sorry, I'm trying to remember my scope of all this. We have been providing those student level counts in Bighorn so that school districts and charter schools can go in and pull those counts and compare them to their own for that validation purposes. We have not shared that information yet for fiscal year 26 or 27 because we're still going through the legislative budget approval process and we don't have a final count yet to share. But for the prior 2 years that we have pulled these counts, we have uploaded those into Bighorn so that you can cross-reference those with your data.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so it's 11 o'clock and I want to honor everybody's time. I appreciate you joining us today. I appreciate the discussion. And if there's anything else, you're welcome to Teams me or shoot me an email. And otherwise, we'll wrap it up and look forward to seeing you all back in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.